So yesterday, here in the temple, of course many of you were here, we had the memorial service, the celebration of life for my beloved spiritual teacher of 40 years for me, Roy Eugene Davis. And the temple was filled with love and the grief that goes with that love, at loss, the physical body, and gratitude. So there was just this outpouring of love. And then this morning, how beautiful that we had the blessing of the baby in the temple and an outpouring of love. The joy, this arrival of this new soul into this realm, and the love of the family that surrounds him. So I think about those 2 days in the temple here and that presence of love, unmistakable presence of love. And I was thinking about a poem written by one of the Sufi mystics that said, I will write you a book about this radical love if you don't require me to separate human love from divine love. Because it has the same root, which is life itself, love itself. We come from love, we are love. And as we discover that truth of our being, we radiate that love to all. I have been talking about love's discipline the last few messages with you. And this beautiful book on radical love, teachings and poems from the Islamic mystical tradition, and the translator and editor is Ahmed Safi. And he wrote, for the mystics of the path of radical love, or ishq, is not a sentiment or an emotion. This radical love is not a sentiment or an emotion. It is the very overflowing of God into this realm. It is this radical love that erupts out of God, bringing us into being. It is this love that sustains us, and it will be this cosmic current that will carry us back home. This, by the way, is identical to the teachings of yoga, that there is a current of creation that flows out from the Godhead of itself, not separate from. We don't talk about creation like God created. We say God emanates creation because there is no separation. That which is absolute reality expresses itself as all that is. And then the teaching tells us there is a current of divine love which draws it back to itself, that calls us to awaken. So I have expressed this as the way that we feel it are like those nudges of divine love that call us to awaken and to be the very growing edge of divine love itself. We live now, today, in an awakening world. So there is the individual process of awakening to the truth of our being, awakening to divine love, which is this wholeness, this absolute experiential knowing that it is all God, that this life we live is God's life, and that every person is an expression of that. So we come to live in relationship with that divinity itself, with one another, with the earth. That we're living a sacred life. We're living a divine life. We're not separate from that. We are swimming in it like fish in the ocean. But we often swim in the ocean like the fish who is thirsty. But this is an individual process of waking up, but it is also a global process that we're involved in. This is waking up to the truth. And it is only this truth of our real nature as divine love itself that is going to solve the very grave difficulties that we have facing us in the world, isn't it? You know, it just, the technology that we have may improve some elements of our life, but it is the divine technology, a divine love that is going to really help us, because it has to open our eyes to see the truth, to see a new way to live. So, what does it require of us, this waking up? I was reminded of the teachings of Jesus, where he said, to be awake in this world, to be awake to divine love, you have to be born again. So we see the little child comes into the world, there's a physical birth, and we know that child's true self is the spirit that has taken on that body. But first we come into the world in that body, and then at some point we begin to identify with that body and with that mind and with that family and with that tribe and with that community. And we don't so much recall the absolute truth of our being. So there are these nudges that happen in our life, starting very early on, actually. I came across a reading from a novel that was written, I think, in the 1920s, A High Wind in Jamaica. I guess in the 80s we knew about different high winds in Jamaica, but this is, anyway. High Wind in Jamaica, the author, Richard Hughes, uses the character of this 10-year-old girl to talk about this experience of what happens to us. So this is an excerpt from that book, High Wind in Jamaica. And then an event did occur to Emily of considerable importance. She's 10. She suddenly realized who she was. It suddenly flashed into her mind that she was she. She began to laugh rather mockingly. Well, she thought, in effect, fancy you, of all people, going and getting caught like this. You can't get out of it now, not for a very long time. You'll have to go through being a child and growing up and getting old before you'll be quit of this mad prank. Once convinced of this astonishing fact that she was now Emily Bass Thornton, she began seriously to reckon its implications. There are many stories that we find, and of course we have our own stories of those moments of, hey! I remember my husband Amar telling me about his guru, Baba Haridas, telling him the story that when he was about 8 years old, that he went to his mother and he said to her, "I feel like I'm trapped in a box. Can you help me get out?" She said, "I cannot help you." He said, "I'm leaving." And he began his spiritual quest. And in the story where Jesus says we have to be born again, we have this contrast of the different levels of consciousness. It's in this story, which we find in the Gospel of John, he meets up with Nicodemus, and Nicodemus is in a literal consciousness, body, mind, identity consciousness. And Jesus is a mystic. He is a radical lover of God and of truth. And so Nicodemus comes to him and says, "We know that you're a teacher who comes from God because nobody can do this stuff that you're doing." This is not literal, this is my version. Nobody can do this stuff that you're doing without God being with him. And so Jesus says to him, "Except a person is born again, they cannot see the kingdom of God." And because Nicodemus is in a literal consciousness, he said, "Well, what do you mean? You know, like when people get old, they're gonna like jump back into the womb and get born again? This makes no sense to me of what it means to be born again." And Jesus basically repeats it. This is what the spiritual teacher does, just repeats it. I'm laughing because I was talking to the choir this morning and somebody said something about a new message. "What's your new message?" "I have no new message." And then Joe said, "I've noticed." So Jesus says back to Nicodemus that except a person be born of water and of the Spirit, they cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. And don't get confused when I say this to you, he tells him. "Marvel not about this whole thing that I say to you, you have to be born again." So we have our parents in life who give us as much as they can, right? They give us everything they have. But at some point on our journey, we are looking for something that usually our parents cannot give us. It's very rare. Once in a while, a parent can give that to the child. But even when a parent is spiritually awake, and they have a spiritual connection, like Paramahansa Yogananda's parents were disciples of Lahiri Mahashaya. So they were on the path, they knew the truth, and yet Yogananda still had to find his own teacher, his own spiritual teacher, and his own way, and he went in search of that. So there is a point that we come to where we know that we have to find that connection for us, or that teacher who can help us with that second birth in life, who can help us be born of the Spirit to lead a new life. And I remember my father. I had this story when I was a little girl. We used to go up into the Russian River area. And my grandmother had a little house there, a little cabin in a little town, little place called Camp Meeker. And it was just outside of Sebastopol. And we used to go down to a little swimming hole. They had made a swimming hole by damming up a tributary of the Russian River, I would think, you know. And so they made a little beach for the people who were in that community could go and swim in the summer. That was a huge thing for me as a child. And so as a little girl, 4, 5, 6, 7, you know, I didn't know how to swim. And they had a little kiddie pool, you know, that was roped off, one little section that was shallow that the kids could play and splash in. But how I wanted to go into this pool, you know, where the water was dammed up and you could see from the little beach they made across to the other side where there were trees and the reeds that grow up along the water's edge like that. And I would watch the adults swimming out in that deep, deep water. But because I couldn't swim, I couldn't go. But my father would come and he would lay down in the shallow water and he would let me climb on his back. And then he would swim across to the other side. I was like a little princess sitting up, just observing the world as my father swam across to the other side. And when we got to the other side, and we would stand together and I could look back at the shore. And I could see a very different view from there of the beach and all the people and how that looked. And so my father gave me that experience. He supported me in learning that there was another way I could see life. But I had to learn to swim for myself. And I had to find out the truth about life for myself in a way that my father could not give me. When I was a teenager, he would sometimes become exasperated with me, as parents can with teenagers. I once heard a joke about parents with teenagers and the parent saying to the teenager, "Leave home now while you still know everything." So I was one of those. And my father used to say to me, "Just wait, you know, one of these days you'll find out about the real world." And for my father, the real world was a very difficult place. It was a harsh place. It was a hard place. He did everything that he could to support his family. He worked hard, worked in the steel mill, worked nights. The world was a hard place, and he wanted to shelter me, but he also knew, you know, from his perspective, I was going to find out about the real world. But I had a yearning inside of me to find out about the real world that took me to my guru, that took me to my spiritual teacher, to be born again and to find out about the real world, the world of love, the world of joy, the world of the truth of our being. And that's what it is to be born again. And when we are born again in the spirit, when we know the truth of our being, then we begin to live in love. We had a little chanting yesterday. The saying from my teacher is, "Do what you know you should do." When you wake up and know that you're love itself, you begin to do what you know you should do. You begin to live in harmony with that truth of your being. Oh, I thought we should do what we know we should do. Do what we know we must do. and do what we know we can do. My teacher was famous. You know, he was known all over the world. So I'm going to conclude with this poem dedicated to him this morning. I didn't write it. It's by Naomi Shihab Nye. It's called Famous. The river is famous to the fish. The loud voice is famous to silence, which knew it would inherit the earth before anybody said so. The cat sleeping on the fence is famous to the birds, watching him from the birdhouse. The tear is famous briefly to the cheek. The idea you carry close to your bosom is famous to your bosom. The boot is famous to the earth, more famous than the dress shoe, which is famous only to floors. The bent photograph is famous to the one who carries it, and not at all famous to the one who is pictured. I want to be famous to shuffling men who smile crossing streets, sticky children in grocery lines, famous as the one who smiled back. I want to be famous in the way a pulley is famous, or a buttonhole, not because it did anything spectacular, but it never forgot what it could do. Let us do what we should do, what we must do, what we can do as we awaken to love. Namaste.